and Chile is just bringing your slides up now.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here and an honor. This place has been in my mind since the second I was accepted to the University of Victoria, which is on lands that have a relationship with the Lekongwen, Sani, and Esquimalt peoples. I personally have lived on the lands of the Potawatomi in South Bend, Indiana, and the Mohawk, and coming to Canada has really helped me reevaluate my own relationship to Indigenous lands in the United States, especially, in Albany, New York, the idea of the Mohawk people being forcefully relocated through the Erie Canal as construction, the Trail of Tears, and I am so grateful to be able to see such rich Indigenous culture in Canada and to really think about how the U.S. could handle these subjects in new ways. All right. Okay. One of the questions that was proposed when we were preparing for this conference was, are artists obliged to respond to the crises of their times? I was fortunate to be able to listen to Jeffrey Rubinoff speak through the YouTube video, and this was a very important question for him in terms of being potentially what one might call a Cold War artist. His response essentially, or at least how I interpret it, was, well, this so-called Cold War, this nuclear question, it's not over yet, so why compartmentalize this era in history? The Situationists International had pretty similar views, so I decided to focus on this nuclear question and this idea of are artists obliged to respond to the crises of their times? Situationists answer yes. All right, so the following quote by surrealist Annie Lebrun argues that crises are part of being human, but an enormous shift happened in the human consciousness as a result of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which wasn't simply a crisis, but a threat of total planetary annihilation. She says, the notion of disaster is an inherent part of the human mind. It appears as soon as we wonder about ourselves. From the moment when the possibility of annihilation became real, first with Hiroshima and the nuclear disasters that followed it, imagination was suddenly deprived of the unsettling feeling of this distorted perspective. And here it should be emphasized that, seized by the novelty of the atomic situation, and it's interesting that she uses the word novelty, André Breton did not hesitate to declare in 1948, the end of the world is not ours. The Situationist International aimed to reclaim a world that was, quote, ours, as people, by working counter to institutionalized human extinction through programs in support of what they called everyday life. Lebrun, corresponding closely with Situationist founder Guy Debord after the dissolution of the movement, the threat of nuclear annihilation was planetary and thus brought the mythos of nationality into question. The world was not ours. It was run by threatening governments who could destroy humanity. In recent decades, many have come to categorize the threat of nuclear winter as a Cold War, as behind us. But I believe, and I think Rubinoff did too, that these nuclear threats were not in the past. And recent news seems to bring these imminent concerns back to the forefront. In order to undermine the mythos of nationality, the Situationist was founded as an international movement rather than a localized art group in 1957. Often when people ask about them, they'll say, oh, where are they from? Paris? They're French, and I say, no, we're not going to make that category. Many of them are not French, and they were an international movement with a lot of international correspondence. Their founding actually was profoundly inspired by a Japanese student union, Zengakuren, which conducted decades of protests against the US occupation of Japan beginning in 1945 and continuing into the 1970s. This 1967 English language publication was created by Zenga Karin and sent to the Situationists International. It's currently in the Mustafa Hayati papers at Yale. Hayati, other Situationists, and students from Strasbourg wrote a pamphlet titled On the Poverty of Student Life in 1967, where they called Zenga Karin the most important group in the world. Guy Debord, Situationist founder, suggested that the SI display photos of protests by Zenga Karin in high-end Parisian art galleries promoted by cocktail hour events. Zenga Karin's protest defined what Debord believed to be the sole value and role of art and cinema, to create situations that would confront oppressive global power dynamics. In 1952, Debord wrote a promotion for his film house Farsad in the letters magazine Ion, where he stated his views on the role of art and cinema, quote, "Future art must create situations or nothing at all." As an uncopyrighted publication, On the Poverty of Student Life was quickly translated and reprinted in over 18 languages. A leading Parisian student protest group in May 1968, called the Council for Maintaining Occupations, considered this text to be the #1 inspiration for the 1968 student riots, which proceeded to spark international protests throughout the 1960s and 70s, and even was referenced as an inspiration for Arab Spring in 2012. Notice how the 1968 translation of Seattle-based Helix depicts a mushroom cloud as an ominous brain, anthropomorphizing nuclear annihilation, as well as indicating that it's a man-made horror. I apologize for the language used here. I hope that you understand that I'm showing it with a critical perspective. In terms of the Berkeley edition, of On the Poverty of Student Life by the Council for the Eruption of the Marvelous from 1970. Chapter 2 of the pamphlet was almost entirely rewritten, and Zenga Karin was omitted. By 1970, this pro-situ group had heard from Situationist René Vianney that his meeting with Zenga Karin in Japan went very poorly because the movement, Zenga Karin, had shifted toward mainstream Leninism, which didn't suit the Situationist program in favor of everyday life. Notice how rewrites by the Berkeley group not only discuss nuclear annihilation, but also fears of an Asian other. UC Berkeley came to prominence due to its investment in nuclear research, and during World War II, Berkeley's population skyrocketed. The military-industrial complex elevated the university from a small suburb to a well-known city. Their administration was characterized by a powerful team of nuclear physicists, many of whom developed atomic weapons, including Chancellor Glenn Seaborg, a physicist who would leave the university to head the Atomic Energy Commission. It's no wonder that the critiques of the university in On the Poverty of Student Life appealed to Berkeley student protesters. René Vianney, in 1974, would create a semi-autobiographical take on Zenga Karin in his film The Girls of Camaret, where he used pornography to make political points. The script read like a political essay. This Japanese language film is set in Japan, but seems to reference the city Camaret on the Atlantic coast, dissolving concepts of nationality and relating Japanese concerns to France. The Girls of Camaret also appears as a line in a bawdy satirical French folk song about a priest. Vianney's film portrays the antagonists not as priests, but as academics invested in critical theory and Lacan. The conflation of French and Japanese concerns further relates to occupation and colonialism, perhaps as a protest of how France participated in Allied occupation. The sexual politics of Japan during occupation included the establishment of brothels as part of an institution for occupiers, which it was argued would, quote, avoid rape cases. Meanwhile, censorship abounded in Japan, and the sexual liberations that took place elsewhere in the 1960s were suppressed. The Girls of Camaret brings such political considerations to the forefront and frames European and American issues as the perpetrators of of the major political issues in Japan. So, just being real obvious here. What does sexuality have to do with protesting nuclear war? Certainly, it relates to issues with Japanese occupation, but also the Situationists International considered sex part of life, which was opposed to the idea of imminent annihilation. Returning to Guy Debord's 1952 film House for Sod, we see a black screen that shifts into a blinding white light, uninhibited by celluloid, and voiceover gives us the impression of an omnipotent God decreeing sexualized horrors like death would be a steak tartare, wet hair on the scalding beach of our silence. The black and white represent nuclear life, light, and silent death, but the stories of escapades in the voiceover, perhaps the aesthetics of shadows of bodies in from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, evoke nuclear horror similar to the gnawing visual reminders in the opening montage of the cynical love story Hiroshima Mon Amour. The atomic bomb was often conflated with sexuality in popular culture, an allusion Debord makes in his 1972 film, The Society of the Spectacle. The first bikini was released in Paris just 4 days after the US performed a nuclear test at Bikini Atoll. Debord acknowledged that nuclear warfare did not end with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It already made its mark on the planet, and coupled with pollution would continue to propel the planet toward inevitable destruction. René Vianney continues to advocate against the destructiveness of nuclear power in Taiwan. In a 2021 interview, he stated, as the negotiator in Taipei of the French supply to Taiwan Power Company of enriched uranium, I was the main messenger of France's commitment that the recycling option for spent nuclear fuel would be open once Taipei decided for it. Personally, I'm not comfortable with my Taiwanese family and millions of other people living near the 4 oversaturated reactor pools. These pools were never designed for long-term storage. They are transfer pools intended for a few years cooling of the spent fuel taken before it is taken away. So let's return one more time to this opening question. Are artists obligated, to respond to the crises of their times? We've assumed that the answer is yes, but I think that it makes sense maybe to replace the word artist with just we. Why artist? Why not just people? And what defines an artist anyway? I'd rather not try to define what an artist is and just project ourselves into the question. So then we're working with the question, are we obligated to respond to the crises of our times? So what is our time? Is it right now? Is it post-war? Is time a construct, as Debord said? Is the modern also the most archaic, as Debord said? So reframing the question again, are we obligated to respond to the crises around us, in the world? So let's just assume that, yes, we're deciding to existentially because we're compelled by some sort of phenomenology of spirit. That leads to a follow-up question, how? Debord seems to respond to this with an answer that maybe we can find an alternative behavior related to everyday life. And Henri Lefebvre inspires Debord and the Situationists to think that a revolution is defined by a movement that changes the overall lives of all people, including all people's everyday lives. So, what are the alternatives? Where is the space to have these chances to just be weird, I guess, is what the SI argued, in a way, partly. Because it was seen as an alternative to anti-human hegemonic structures that fuel death machines. So again, the question, are we able to respond to the crises of our times? I would say in terms of the word obliged, obligated, either one, it's actually maybe easier to not respond because you can just perpetuate the same sort of boring monotone violence of existing institutions of crisis. I would say no one is holding a gun to your head, but that wouldn't be entirely true. The guns out there are trying to obligate a lack of response, so maybe we're not obligated. So then the final question that I'll leave you with is just, are you brave enough?
Thank you, Anna, so much. And thank you, all 5 of you. I can't believe it. We did 5 talks in an hour and we were on schedule. So pretty amazing. Also, I just want to say the amount of information, the number of ideas you squeeze, each of you, into 10 minutes is extraordinary. I'm in awe of all of you, and I learned a great deal over the last 60 minutes. So thank you very much. We've got a bit of time now, 25 minutes or so, for some questions to any one of these students, or to all of them, or any observations or comments you'd like to make. Starting, of course, with Malia.
Congratulations to all of you. Go Vikes. All your papers rock. Okay. Can you hear me now? Yes, okay. My question, though, is for Raha, specifically because this is something that really interests me in architectural history, this kind of Renaissance traditions, especially in the modern period. They're in many different, especially post-colonial countries. There's this need to modernize, to be avowedly modern on the world stage, but also to select a golden age in the past and to unite these two. Of course, this is not happening exactly like this in Iran because it wasn't colonized. But something with these Renaissance traditions that I always ask is, what particular moment in history are they looking back to for an isolating, after all these thousands of years in Iranian history, what is being selected? And also in Iran, well, just like in India, and maybe in a number of different cultures, there's these different layers of appropriation, because I saw some Safavid references, but then the Safavids are modeling themselves also after the Achaemenids, etc. So I think there's so many exciting layers of politically informed or like nationalist informed architectural history going on there. And I really look forward to seeing how this develops, because it's the topic of your master's, right?
Yeah, actually.
Oh.
I'm working
So exciting.
as I'm really interested in the topic of hybridity in architecture, my final research is about a building in Shiraz, my hometown. It's a gate, and actually this building has a hybrid style. Unfortunately, we don't know about an architect, so I tried to just find some example that at the same time they were built. But all this kind of renaissance in Iranian architecture, I think, is back to Reza Shah Pahlavi, as he wanted to build a modern Iran, but at the same time, he wanted to just emphasize on nationality and to just emphasis on the just glorious past of Iran, especially pre-Islamic period, Achaemenid and Sassanid period. But some architects like Hushang Seyhun try to show that both period, Islamic and pre-Islamic period, is very important for Iranian architectural history. So he, for example, we have some European architects such as André Godard. He built some building that inspired from pre-Islamic period, but but Seyhun tried to show that okay, both this period are respectable, and we should see both of them. At the same time, we should just use some achievement from the modernism and follow our tradition. And thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Yes, Vid.
Yeah, just to echo Maria's comment, fantastic talks, all five were fabulous. My question is for Darsu and this painting, which I thought was, yeah, kind of mind-blowing, and that it existed in 1901. I mean, obviously I don't know enough about the Ottoman context, but as far as I know, as far as I do understand it, it just seems kind of, yeah, amazing. So I was wondering, given that you said that the painting was not exhibited in the Ottoman Empire, what was the audience for it?
Can you hear me? Okay, so it was exhibited first in Berlin, and then again in Berlin, and then in London. I would say around that time, because of the Orientalism as an ideology or whatever it is, it was very popular, and he was there as a Turkish representative, where every time when he exhibited his work, even if his name was not in it, it would write just Turkish artist. So it was a bit tokenistic representation to all of Europe. So, yeah.
Can I just quickly follow up? I mean, so did it have like it seems in that case that it would have a completely different meaning for the artist possibly and the audience? You know, so if you're saying that the audience perhaps received it in a sort of Orientalist fashion as a kind of, an exotic image of a, woman in a mosque, was that meaning very different from what the artist might have had in mind as a kind of a commentary on religion? Or was he performing Orientalism in some sense?
So that is an extremely huge question, because there is like a lot of commentary about this painting and this artist, but let me try to summarize. So yes, he might be Orientalist, he might not be, who knows, but he might be Orientalist because he chose to go to France. He chose to get the Professor Jerome and Boulanger, another Orientalist painter, as a professor, like as a teacher. And when it was exhibited in Europe, Europeans only wrote in their newspapers and stuff, there was a Turkish painter, it was amazing, but they only talked about the yellow dress and how it was so eye-catching. So they didn't even look at the books. And when now in Turkey we don't use Arabic letters, even though the language is the same. So when in Turkey it was first exhibited, Turkish people thought all the books are Quran because they were in Arabic letters, so they didn't understand. But in the artist's I don't see how he cannot be against religion with this painting. And even just the lectern, sitting on the lectern would be considered extremely, but I do not know if he painted this from a European gaze or if it was his gaze. The only proof, which I didn't put on the presentation because I didn't have time, is a letter he wrote to his father when he was in France, where he talks about how the system, the mosques, the obelisks were so corrupted and how he couldn't bear to go to Ottoman again. So I hope it answered your question.
Yes, Anne Breen.
Yeah, my question is with Darsu again. So Darsu, this is really intriguing, and particularly I'm interested in the mihrab, the word, and Genesis. Is this the artist name given to the painting, or any art historian gave the name? Because mihrab, as you have suggested already in the presentation, that it's an architectural feature. And if you just focus on the word mihrab, it comes from the root haraba, which means to fight. So mihrab is basically the battlefield, and it has been interpreted in very different ways. But I'm not sure why. And you said that this was not in the mosque. He used it as a prompt to just...
So this mihrab is extremely old. Like I said, I will repeat it. It means facing the Qibla in mosques. It's a wall normally. It's very, very old. It was actually in an old mosque, and then they took it. And it has been for centuries then standing outside, and they put this in a museum, imperial museum now called Istanbul Archaeology Museum, founded by Osman Hamdi, the painter. And when he passed away, the paintings he painted came back to Turkey, to his families. And one of the biggest writers about this subject, one of the biggest academics of this subject is his grandson, basically. And he founded that the real name is Genesis based on its publication when Osman Hamdi was alive. It was it was put in the name of Genesis. But when it came back to Turkey, when they first seen the painting, because they didn't know the name, a Turkish writer called Mustafa Cezar thought, why not, let's call it mihrab, because he's seen the mihrab and it's very famous mihrab. So, and the battlefield would fit into this painting, as I believe this painting symbolizes a very transformational era where also fits into the talk about Raha, where in the beginning of the 20th century, this region, Syria, Iran, Turkey, went into a very secular secularization term. I'm using secularization, I don't know if it fits, because it's also very walking away from religion, but half of the country, and putting European terminology inside the country, but half of the country, like only half does this. And so there is a battlefield inside the country at this point. It's gonna go away. I mean, there's not gonna be any Ottoman left in 2 decades, so.
And we now have a question from Josh Fitzgerald.
Yeah, thanks. Okay. Yeah, so it's building upon that, and so a question for Darsu, but then also moving into a question for Megan, and possibly a question for Anna too. So, but just maybe anyone who wants to reflect on the concept of race or ethnicity in the work. But so for Darsu, so not only is it an internal battlefield, but you also have the Armenian Genocide. That is, I'm wondering how this is sort of like a story of story of nationalism at this time, trying to be concretized in this depiction. Then also, the question for Megan is, how is ethnicity part of that sort of safe, constructive space? How are other women and other women's stories allowed to partake in this important, enabling space to tell different stories, different relationships between this sort of binary of, and the sort of emasculation project, which is so important. And then, and also, this concept of being obligated to engage. It reminded me of this need for, in Black Lives, to, why does it always have to be an obligation to talk about the importance of race and heritage? Why do I always have to teach? Not me. This is me speaking from what I've heard other people. Why do people of color always have to engage in? And so with the Situationists, trying to divest themselves from an ethnicity or a race or sort of what is the, I guess, the effect of, in a way, moving away from that, the complexity of the history of ethnicity in a moment when there could be a fear of, future, a fear of, I don't know if that sort of like, maybe that sort of fell out into some sort of nebulous point I'm trying to make, but I'm interested in how race and ethnicity, heritage kind of factors in. I don't know who would.
Does anyone want to speak to that on the panel?
If you guys don't mind, I'd love to answer that question. Thank you. So I would say that they didn't move away from questions of race. Nationality is different than race and ethnicity, and they question national borders and governments and those structures and means of constructing identity. But you know, many of the Situationists, and I focus mainly right now on Debor Vianney and Mustafa Hayati, were really invested in anti-racist discussions, whether or not they always approached it perfectly. I mean, they knew that they couldn't, and that was the idea of what they called détournement, that they were engaged in a discussion that was counter to oppressive structures, and racism is an oppressive, institutionalized structure. So for Hayati, he would later, you know, move to the Middle East and participate in Palestinian liberation efforts. For Vianney, he moved to Taiwan and became involved in he was always involved, I think, you know, from the beginning of his artistic career in questions of, you know, the relationship between Asian people and colonialism, imperialism. So Debor was actively recruiting Congolese members of the Situationists International. It was one of their primary concerns. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Megan?
Thank you for your question. So in regards to race and other minorities that were represented in this collective and welcoming space, feminist space, I do not know specifically of a specific artist that worked or performed at Women House. In all honesty, not to say that there wasn't, but just full disclosure, I'm not sure. But it's a great, excellent question that I definitely need to look into. But I do think that Women House and the legacy of Women House really broadened and opened a lot of doors for minority groups to have a voice. And it was, the feminist art program at CalArts was so prolific, and it really sparked this resurgence of feminist spaces and art programs. And I think that sparking and resurgence of these programs that weren't necessarily previously present in North America also could have potentially, I don't have specific examples, but I believe sparked other room for other types of minorities and other groups and other programs that emphasize diversity and inclusion of a variety of voices, specifically like women building. That's part of the legacy of Women House, and there were a variety of very diverse voices that were involved in that program as well. And yeah. So something I definitely need to look into more specifically. And of course, this was at the same time, a lot of artists, especially in New York and all over, were really advocating for the rights for individuals, African American individuals, to have a voice and to recognize African American individuals more so, especially like the Artist Workers Coalition, and that was one of their major incentives, and that was going on right at the same time. So, yeah.
We'll take two more questions, unless you have something to say.
Should I answer?
Yes, please, if you want to.
So for your question, so you asked Armenian genocide, how it's affecting this painting. So Armenian genocide will happen 2 decades later, and it's originated from the independence war. And since there is no independence war yet, the only independent country at this point, kinda, is Greece. And Osman Hamdi is from my city, and he's partially Greek and partially Russian as well. Yeah, like me. So it is, I would consider him supporting the independence of these countries. But it is not really represented, and like you said, it is less about nationalism, is less about race, and for Turkey or Ottoman in this case is more about religion, and what kind of Muslim are you? Muslim? Are you Christian? Are you Jewish? So nobody asks about the race at this point. So that would be my answer.
We'll just take two more questions, one from Malia and one from Ambreen. Unless Malia was doing something else with her hand.
No, I just wanted to circle back to Megan and just revisit that point that you were saying about Women House. So this is second wave feminism, and in the early 70s especially, it was very racially siloed. And so you're in second wave feminine, first wave feminist art, that too was very siloed, and I think that's something really to consider. I think that, but there was also simultaneously, especially in California, all of these racial rights movements coming up too. So yeah, I think that's something that is a really good question. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So food for thought.
Jewish Americans, they felt this other.
I don't know.
Miriam Shapiro.
I did,
But they were. I don't know, because I mean, there's the argument that they were passing. Yeah.
Just talking about the fact that the Miriam Shapiro and Judy Chicago were both Jewish American women, and would have. Hi, it's Paul. I just saying that Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro are Jewish American women, and so they would have seen themselves as, at the time, slightly separate from mainstream Anglo culture in America. So I think they would have seen themselves as being other, not necessarily racially, obviously, but definitely coming from a different position.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they were both Jewish, and I haven't read anything in particular about them talking about how they viewed themselves in relation to society at the time, in regards specifically to being Jewish. Of course, a lot about them being women and their feminine experience I have read quite a bit about, but really, really excellent food for thought, and I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you, but I think it's really, really essential to consider how that overlap and that interplay of race and religion are involved in the feminist movement, and in particular, Women's House. Yeah.
Well, the questions keep coming in because the talks are so interesting. So, but I will just, I am just going to resist the urge and just keep it to two questions. So Ambreen, who has been waiting patiently, and then Louis will have the final question of the session.
Okay, I have a question for Jessica. You touched a little bit upon the distinction between being religious and being spiritual, and I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more, coming from your case study, because the text that has been used or the images that has been used in the gospel. So apparently it's coming from the sacred text, but the artist is making that very clear distinction between being religious and being spiritual.
Thank you, Ambreen. I apologize. I may have verbally conflated some things there, which is to say that Eric Gill was died like a card-carrying Catholic, and so religion would be the appropriate term there. John Lane, the person who was interpreting his work and who I drew on for help looking at Gill, was working in writing about Gill in 1989, so 60 years later. And that's one of the things that I've been grappling with in my research, is to understand the difference between religion and spirituality. And so what I've seen and what scholars of religion and the arts have noted is that there's been something what Graham House calls a mutation in the 20th century, that we've gone from talking about religion to being more comfortable with talking about spirituality. And so in the case study, there's kind of concentric circles to my case study where there's Eric Gill, but then there's Eric Gill and arts and crafts and other visionary artists seen through John Lane, and Susie Gablick would be another art critic of that late 20th century period that are starting to broaden this term. You know, religion is just associated with way too much trauma and misuse of power to really be a useful term anymore. So spirituality is something that is more, can I say it, universal, that we can all kind of get on board with without kind of making allegiances. And so that's what I think is really interesting about John Lane, and what I hope sacramentalism can kind of follow that trend, that sacramental isn't sacramentalism isn't the possession of Catholics or Anglo-Catholics. It's a view that can be accessed by anyone, regardless of your, what James Elkins calls metaphysical commitments.
Wonderful. And Louis.
Thank you. I'll just follow up a little bit on the impulse towards a kind of universal claim. Just to go back to the conversation around Megan's presentation, just that many feminists of color had to do a critique on that generation of white feminists who claimed their political struggles as universally women's struggles, and feminists of color had to specify, actually, these are white feminist women's struggles, which is great, but don't claim that you know what my struggles are like. We have different priorities. So it's just like a food for like further research that will be, I'm sure, like super fascinating. But just like a little observation about a couple of moments in the presentation, you talked about this was the first feminist exhibition or something like that. And I can appreciate like kind of the search for origins or something. But for me, I read that as a kind of reiteration of a US imperialism that is very dominant because there's so much documentation coming from the US context. But it's just something to think about twice, because that can have the effect of erasing so many other feminisms from other parts of the world. That's all. Like, I don't think that's your intention, but it's just something to, reflect upon.
No, absolutely. I apologize if I did that. Essentially, what I was trying to say is that more or less it was like the feminist art program was one of the first in America original art programs that was institutionalized in a university, as far as I know. And the issue of race and the big claim of, we represent all women and this universalism is problematic. I do agree with you for sure, and it's something, that I need to look into more about how these artists in particular, of course, like the directors of this, Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro, how they directed their commentary around this program and around this site-based installation piece to include other voices or to not. Maybe not purposely not, who knows, right? Or purposely, but yeah, I need to look into it. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much to all of the students. It's nerve-wracking even if you're an established academic to give a paper. So I'm so in awe of you all for delivering such extraordinary papers. Thank you very much.